Hello, welcome to those of you who are here. We're going to just wait 1 minute while folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thank you again for joining us. As folks are joining, I see the numbers creeping up. Welcome, thank you. As folks trickle in, just pop a message into the chat and let us know where you're from, please. And then we'll get started in just 30 seconds or a minute from now. See a fellow Pennsylvanian in here. Hello, welcome. Again, as folks trickle in just for the next few seconds, we're just testing out the chat box. Pop a message in and let us know where you're from. Say hello, and we'll get started in a few seconds. Great. All right, well, we're a minute in here. We're going to go ahead and get started as folks continue to trickle in. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is the importance of integrating regulatory early into product development. I'm Vernon Baker. I'm your moderator for today's session, and I'm a senior medical device guru at Greenlight Guru. Our mission at Greenlight is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medtech industry. It's likely a shared goal of many of you that are here today. And we host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts like our speaker today, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. And our MedTech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, clinical data management. It's all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So you can join over 1,100 leading MedTech companies that trust Greenlight Guru by visiting greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. And just to see how many of you are paying attention through my spiel there, I want to pop in a quick poll. I'm going to open that now. And if you could, just over the next 30 seconds or so, answer, how do you currently manage your medical device documentation and your quality processes? So you should be seeing that poll now, hopefully. I see a few votes trickling in. We'll just keep it open. I'll watch the clock here, maybe 30 seconds or so. All right, good. I see a lot of votes here. Very good. Okay. All right. We have 50% who use an EQMS tailored for MedTech. Good to hear. Oh, just drop below 50. Very good. Well, that's interesting. Thank you for the information. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now. Very good. Thank you for indulging me on that, guys. Now just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll dive into our presentation. First, as many of you have already found, we want you to actively participate, so use the chat tab to connect with fellow attendees. You can also ask questions. I'll be moderating those questions along with some other folks, and you can ask questions in the Q&A tab. So please, if you look at that Q&A tab, you can see that you can upvote questions with a thumbs up, and we'll try to address those questions first that are most upvoted. So you can check out the Q&A tab, upvote questions. You can also ask your own. And then second, this is a question we always get. We will be sending out the full recording and the presentation slides to all the registrants, and I'll mention that probably a couple more times. We will send those out after the live event, so just watch your email inbox for that follow-up. So now for the good stuff, to introduce today's expert presenter. So Kara Johnson is the VP of Regulatory Affairs at Kapstone Medical, and she served as a regulatory and quality leader at several New England-based medical device companies for over 2 decades. And in recent years, she focused her efforts on guiding early-stage transformative medtech companies to regulatory and compliance success. So Kara's particular strengths and expertise lie in regulatory strategy, compliance, and helping companies achieve and maintain domestic and international market access for new and innovative medical devices. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Kara, for today's feature presentation. And thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vernon. I appreciate the invitation to join you all today. I'm very excited. You'll have to forgive me. This is my first public webinar. So as you can imagine, I'm a little nervous and I have to navigate two screens. So please forgive my darting eyeballs as I go through today's presentation. So first and foremost, what are we going to be talking about today? So over the 20 plus years that I've spent in industry, I never cease to be amazed at how people still don't really seem to understand the value of regulatory. So when should we be involved? What information can we bring to the table? How can you benefit from having us there? I think a lot of times there's even confusion about the differences between quality and regulatory and kind of where those black and white lines get a little blurred. So I'm hoping by the end of today's presentation that, especially for those of you who are in small, startup or maybe moderate sized companies, that you'll come away having a better understanding of really what regulatory does, the value that we bring to the table, especially early in product development. So my presentation today will cover timing, specifically answering the question of when is my product mature enough to involve regulatory, the value of performing a preliminary regulatory assessment, how that then plays into defining the scope of work, the importance of revisiting that regulatory strategy as the design matures throughout product development. And then finally, we'll do a review at the end, in case you were not taking notes, of all the key takeaways and the benefits of involving regulatory early. So let me skip into the next slides here. All right, so first topic we're going to go over today is timing. When is my product mature enough to involve regulatory? So with that, let me get to my other slide here. All right, so this product development timeline is a pretty classic visual representation of what most companies involve in their quality management system. Most of us have some sort of concept phase, a design and development phase, a verification validation phase, some sort of product launch or marketing preparation phase. And then finally, we get clearance and we actually launch our product to the market, during which we have to do post-market surveillance activities, et cetera. So, I think most of us know that regulatory should be involved, except the question is kind of where and when does regulatory get involved? When is the right time to bring in that professional? So I think most companies that I have worked for, and this is not to imply that they're bad companies by any means, but most of them really kind of involve regulatory around phase 2, kind of after they've gotten through their concept phase, as they start to create requirements. Now they're getting curious about, what is my predicate device going to be? What is the regulatory pathway? Can I go 510K? Should I do a pre-submission with FDA? Is this a de novo? Is this something in between? So it's usually around phase 2 when the engineers are getting pretty comfortable and confident with their design that they start saying, maybe I should involve regulatory and quality at this point. Today, I'm here to tell you that I personally believe that that is way too late. And I'll give you some reasons why. So basically, at phase 2, most of your feasibility studies may have actually already happened, or at least early concepts, prototypes, and things have been developed. So some of your early customer feedback may have already been gathered. Any assumptions about your product functionality, your material selection, even your device classification, you may have some thoughts about that. But what about phase 1, this concept phase? What happens in that phase, and should we involve regulatory then? Well, obviously it depends on what your company considers to be phase 1, but most companies consider this to be sort of, the idea, when the concept for the product comes into play. Maybe in some companies, this is when you start to go out and seek investor interest. You're trying to raise revenue, get this thing funded, figure out what your resources are going to be. That's really, honestly, at least what I think is the right time to start involving regulatory. So at this point, we're getting into what that question mark is. So what happens if we involve regulatory before phase 1? So I'm going to declare a new phase that I would love all of us to start considering, and that is phase 0. So phase 0 is what I call initiation opportunity. So our partners here at Greenlight Guru actually call this phase 1 in their development of a new device resource material that they provide publicly. However, in my experience, what I consider to be phase one initiation opportunity is really when your CEOs, your founders, your super smart people who are coming up with this medical device idea are gathering that information that's going to support going out and enticing early stage investors. So during this phase, usually there's some sort of financial review, there's a market analysis, there's a competitive assessment where they're looking at other people in the market who may have something similar that they want to be better than or actually copy because they just want to get into that space as well. They're starting to identify some early risks. And at this stage, risk can be financial, risk can be resource related, risk can be actually related to use of the device itself. So any and all of those risks. They're also looking at legal and IP analysis and filing. So obviously, how are they going to encounter any sort of backlash from industry who may have some similar products on the market? All of those things are being considered at this point. But we should also be looking at regulatory and clinical considerations right here, because quite frankly, if we involve regulatory here, when it's a little bit uncomfortable, start reaching out to regulatory and ask those hard questions of what is our pathway and how are we going to get this through FDA, for example. It's really important we start addressing those concerns and considerations here, because quite frankly, the answers often play into all of those areas that I've outlined above. So for example, financial review often highlights whether the cost to get to market is feasible and whether or not it makes sense. Unfortunately, the approval pathway is sometimes a huge roadblock to companies being able to make it to get to market. So for example, I had a lovely what they thought was class 1 product come to my table the other day and present this great product that is super exciting, but they're a small, like 3-person startup size company. And when I said, ooh, wow, after looking and doing this regulatory assessment, unfortunately, I really can't identify a product code and a comparable set of products on the market already. You guys are new and innovative, and this is super exciting. But I hate to break it to you, I think that this may be a candidate for de novo. And we started looking at the costs of that. I don't want to quote exactly, but if I recall somewhat correctly, a de novo is in the $100,000 plus range at this point to submit to FDA. So these types of financial considerations should be identified early in the game. So even before you start getting into choices about your design, your material selection, all of that, I would be looking at how does your concept actually fall in the regulatory landscape. So in terms of market analysis and competitive assessments there, both of those help to identify potential predicate devices, which we can leverage in our regulatory strategy, and then also look at whether or not the product's success in those areas warrants us also going into that market area. In terms of approval for those products, those potential predicate devices, what issues did they encounter during their review with FDA? How much can we glean from their 510K summaries? Is there any sort of public media or social media out there where they've commented on their experience with FDA? Because especially nowadays, companies, especially startups, are actually getting more vocal about sharing their experiences. So all of that can be leveraged and assessed early on to help this phase of a project. Risk assessments inform your test strategy, your labeling strategy, your usability testing that you might have to do, of course, all of which need to be resourced and documented and potentially submitted to FDA. As far as your legal analysis and your filings, believe it or not, I personally really like to get involved in looking at those early because, quite frankly, they serve the basis to form a lot of your future marketing claims, your regulatory indications, maybe even some of your limitations around what contraindications you need to include. And they really create the foundation upon which regulatory professionals like myself assess the approval pathway and identify any potential market barriers. So involving us early in the process, even when you think you have a product that's super cool and you want to bring into the world, I really think it's a great idea to involve a regulatory professional at this stage. So again, not to throw any bones out there, but a lot of these investment portfolios are created by really smart, MBA executives, but unfortunately, many of those executives do not have experience in regulatory. So they really don't understand the implications of misrepresenting the proposed regulatory pathway for any new or modified devices. So their assumptions may be founded on previous experience. They may have worked at another med device company or some other med tech even device company. But honestly, without having a regulatory professional who is actively involved on a day-to-day basis, monitoring the trends, monitoring what changes have occurred, even the regulations, the guidelines. As we all know, those of us who are in reg, they change pretty frequently. I mean, it's surprising, especially over a couple of years, how FDA's perspective on things like software development, obviously with the new AI and ML, all those areas, they're constantly evolving, how FDA wants to see information submitted. So having a professional, regulatory professional on your team early really helps for your CEOs and executives to be able to avoid very uncomfortable conversations that you would otherwise have when you need to revisit the fact that you kind of misrepresented your regulatory pathway and now you need to raise more money because, as per my earlier example, you thought it was going to be a class 1, no submission required, except oops, it's actually a de novo and now we need to raise an extra $100,000 to see it through the process. So again, there's a lot of reasons why involving regulatory at phase, what I'm going to call phase 0, is really, really important. So moving on. Now we get into, I've talked a lot about the value of a preliminary regulatory assessment, except you might be wondering, what is an actual regulatory assessment? Quite frankly, all the companies that I've worked for over the years have a different definition of what they include, what kind of information they include in a regulatory assessment. So I'm going to kind of give you the keys to the kingdom here in terms of what I believe to be the most beneficial information. Quite frankly, as your product develops, especially in phase 0, phase 1, some of the answers to these areas may not be obtainable at this point in time. I think as the product develops, you're going to revisit and answer some of these areas. But hopefully in the beginning, you can start with at least things like identifying your unmet clinical need, right? So this is the question of, what clinical problem is this device trying to solve? What in the landscape of the medical device world, what is the risk associated with using this particular device? What solution is it trying to provide versus what is the benefit and also the risks identified with this device? So really starting with identifying your unmet clinical need, I think, is kind of the beginning of what your regulatory assessment should cover. Next, we're going to look at highlighting unique device features and functionality. So what does this do and what does that mean? First, does the device achieve its intended use through any sort of new or novel approach? Something that I, quite frankly, can't say that there's another, say, 510K device on the market already to which I can say, yep, we're just like them, we're another Me Too device. So identifying anything that's different, are you achieving it in a way that FDA is going to say, I have some concerns about how you've implemented those design features or functionalities. Identifying that early on is going to help you with your test burden and test considerations. Also, in terms of identifying your requirements, your mitigations to those risks, all of that, right? The big circle of risk management really plays into identifying really early what your unique device features and functionalities are. Again, playing into, is it the same as another device? Does the device features or functionality lead to a particular design, material selection, or other test considerations? Those are questions that we regulatory professionals can actually help you answer very early in product development, at least starting to get the wheels spinning and thinking about what should we be thinking about, what should we be considering at this stage in the game. So next, defining our proposed indications for use. Most of you who are regulatory and quality professionals are like, well, yeah, obviously we should be thinking about that. But honestly, this is a huge issue from day one. I've worked with a lot of startups. and a lot of how you're positioning this product on the market. What is your regulatory pathway? Are there going to be new things you're going to have to defend to FDA while also still trying to wedge it under, no, we're a Me Too device under this product code? Your indications for use is kind of the core foundation of your submission. So identifying your user population, your clinical environment, your principles of operation, all of that up front is going to really start to clarify what your regulatory pathway is going to look like. In terms of obviously also considering your product code, clearly that plays into your product classification. So revealing if it's class 1, class 2, class 3. And oh, by the way, most of my presentation today is covering FDA considerations, but you can apply these thoughts and pathways to really any sort of international regulatory agency as well. It's not really, the takeaways today are not necessarily unique to FDA. It's just the one that I think we can all relate to the most, being a mostly US-based audience. So next up would be regulatory history. So at a lot of companies, especially the startups, maybe the moderate sized companies, you probably don't have a regulatory history. You probably haven't put something like this on the market before. Maybe you have had one pre-submission a couple of years ago. As a regulatory professional, I'm going to want to say, okay, great. Can you provide me with access to that conversation, the outputs, the meeting minutes, because I'd really love to dig in and see what was discussed. But honestly, it's rare that a smaller or a mid-sized company will come to me already having engaged with FDA. So we actually have an opportunity to sort of decide upfront before we get to submission day, what do we want that history to look like? Do we want to be super cowboy? Do we have the resources to have multiple submissions and pre-submissions and have early engagement conversations with FDA? Or again, do you want to just be the Wild Wild West cowboys who say, no, we know what we're doing. We're going to follow our regulatory leader and we're just going to go in and submit and see what happens, right? I think we actually have an opportunity based on our regulatory assessment to also choose our poison, if you will, moving forward. So that helps. We can also choose things like 513G if we're unsure, for indications for use, our presumed product codes, our classification starts to kind of leave some questions about, well, have we classified this device correctly? That's a great opportunity for someone to identify that, maybe the first step we actually should do is a 513G instead of even a pre-submission. Get FDA to tell us what the classification is. Get FDA to tell us what the testing burden should be for this device. Next up would be, and I think I already talked about it a little bit, but anticipated product classification and regulation. Once we have that identified, there's a lot that you can look under the product code and reveal any recognized consensus standards. Obviously, if you have multiple product codes that actually apply to your device, that's going to start to reveal not only your regulatory pathway, but also some testing burden that you might assume, whether or not, for example, you have to consider some human factors testing or some clinical studies along the way. So definitely good to look at that early. And potential predicates. Again, we touched on this a little bit already, but identifying early on what your potential predicates are going to be is, it's, again, for those of us who are regulatory professionals, it's kind of like, well, yeah, no kidding kind of statement. But for a lot of people who have not done this before, going through the exercise of identifying other products on the market that we can leverage either as a, yes, we're just like them, or to actually confirm, wow, we're really unlike no one else on the market. Therefore, we actually have to carve out our own regulatory strategy, our own regulatory pathway for this device. Knowing that upfront in a regulatory assessment is hugely valuable, hugely valuable. Because of course, again, that plays into revealing what your clinical data is going to have to be, if any, what additional test burden, what standards you have to consider being compliant with. All of that gets defined in part from your predicate research. And then last but not least, in a good regulatory assessment, we're also going to identify some quality considerations. And what do I mean by that? So I like to actually help out my clients and say, okay, here are the procedures and controls that your quality system should have in place to support the 510K and or regulatory submission. But it also identifies gaps, potential gaps, because if in all of the information above, I've now discovered, yeah, we're going to have to do some clinical studies for this product. Well, now from a quality perspective, I'm going to ask clients like, have you come up with a monitoring procedure, or do you have someone in-house that can create an informed consent, for example? So it starts to identify roles, responsibilities, and documentation needs that are going to all roll up into a successful submission to FDA. So moving on. Next, we're going to discover how that regulatory assessment defines our scope of work. So as a person who now works in the consulting world full time, I can tell you that a really well-defined regulatory assessment directly identifies a very good scope of work. So a well-done regulatory assessment has the power to eliminate potential roadblocks to product development before they happen. So understanding the device's intended and indications for use, including user needs, they drive the key design considerations such as material selection, your form factor, functionality, any potential accessories with the product, etc. All of this becomes product requirements, right? So if we're following our normal product development process, as we start to kind of lay that groundwork of what we're expecting from our regulatory assessment, all those key activities that we're going to have to perform, now we can start to generate the documentation that's going to support that. So in turn, once we start having product requirements, this directly impacts the scope and depth of our test burden, because as you know, we like to make sure that our requirements are meaningful and actually testable. I could do a whole other presentation on the importance of writing good requirements, but we'll do that a different day. So at this point, we want to make sure that our test burden is associated with those key design decisions, such as confirming the need for biocompatibility testing, usability testing, sterilization, user interface testing, cybersecurity, software validation, et cetera, right? Depending on what your key design considerations are. By considering these key areas, the project schedule now starts to solidify. So we're actually seeing how an early regulatory assessment starts to lay out the key road for product development, right? So we can start to solidify and reveal all the different resource needs now that we have looked at our testing, our requirements, what sort of impact, what standards we need to include, if we have to do cybersecurity testing, for example. So now we're not only identifying just topics that need to be covered, but from that we can drill down and start identifying resources and then look at our companies and say, okay, well, do we have, Frank, is he great at cybersecurity testing? Oh, wait, no, Frank's an electrical engineer. Oh, shoot. Okay, well, we don't actually have anybody in-house for cyber testing. We're going to have to go to a third party, for example. So it can start to reveal some of the things you may not have considered when you came up with this wonderful medical device idea that's still just at concept phase, right? Very early on, you can start to identify the path you're going to have to take just through product development because of a regulatory assessment. So in the consulting world, a well-done regulatory assessment informs the statement of work that we use as a way to agree and disagree with our clients about what we're going to do for them, how we can support them through their regulatory experience and their medical device development experience. So honestly, at the end of the day, all of my clients had the same questions for me, which is, how long will it take till I can sell this on the market? How much will it cost for me to get there? And how many resources will it take? Well, the good news is a really good regulatory assessment informs the answers to all of those questions. So it's a very, very useful tool. All right, so next up, adapting to device design evolution, the importance of revisiting our regulatory strategy as the design matures. So Eric Raz wisely said, a pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. I thought that was a very fitting sentence, very fitting quote, because it does really sort of embody the idea of product development in the medical device world. There's always going to be this idea that we want a product to get to market, right? We have this vision of how this is going to have an amazing impact on our clinicians, on our patients, but how we get there is going to have to be something that we revisit frequently because things come up. So inevitably, you'll be faced with a fork in the road at some point during product development. learn to embrace that change, learn to find confidence in your ability to pivot. I think this is something that a lot of medical device companies struggle with, quite frankly. They had this really well-defined, clear plan, and then something happens, because it always does, and all of a sudden they have to adjust. And to me, I think the difference between a company that makes it and a company that doesn't is a company that learns to pivot and embrace the pivot versus a company that sort of crumbles under the pressure and doesn't know how to pick up the pieces and keep going. So something that can help you keep going. If you're that company, you're like, oh, wow, yeah, she's sort of identified my company. We've definitely crumbled when we hit that fork in the road and we didn't know how to handle it. Great. Pull in your regulatory person, because I promise you, if you ask them to revisit that regulatory strategy, that regulatory assessment, with now keeping in mind how things have changed and the choices that you're presented with at this fork in the road, this is a great opportunity to have regulatory redo that assessment so you can start now to make some informed and educated decisions. So as the design matures, your regulatory needs may change, right? An iterative review of the product design and development ensures compliance throughout the process, not just at the beginning or just at the end. If you keep them involved from day one to the end, you're ensuring that you're compliant, you have very thoughtful approach to how you're going to address your regulatory conversations with FDA, obstacles with FDA, whatever it may be. So I definitely encourage that. It also encourages the project team to adjust the strategy to meeting shifting requirements, reducing the risk of non-compliance in later stages, right? So maybe, for example, you thought that your contact duration of your product was going to be limited use. But then as you actually went out and did some initial feasibility studies, some feedback, start looking at your user needs, now all of a sudden you realize, wow, okay, well, a biocompatibility actually can be based on repeated use and application of a device as well. So maybe limited use is no longer appropriate. Now we have to shift, we have to pivot and go to a prolonged contact duration instead. Oh, how does that impact our test strategy? Great, pull in your regulatory person, have them answer that, go through the 1099 guidance and answer those questions about, impacts to biocompatibility testing. Ooh, well, great. Going from limited use to prolonged now means you have a new litany of standards you have to test to. I've recently done this, hence why it's a topic today. And that, of course, impacts your budget, your resources, the amount of time you're going to spend in V&V. So again, involving regulatory throughout the process, really, really important. So what are some adaptation examples during each of the phases? So in phases 0, which again, initiation concept, and also concept phase, which most of us call phase 1, as discussed earlier, the early focus is on identifying applicable regulations and classification, your initial risk assessment, and all of that is being based on your intended use and potential hazards. So hopefully that's the beginning of your regulatory story, if you will. As you get into prototype phase, a lot of this is sort of bridging the gap between concept into your development phase, so which is usually phase 2, thereabouts. This phase reveals potential engineering and manufacturability challenges, which may impact the design, may in fact the actual functionality of the device, the user needs, definitely can impact your potential hazards associated with the use of the device, and it may even possibly impact your indications or intended use. You may have designed a really amazing product that doesn't do what you wanted it to do, but maybe it can still do something else. So not all is lost if you discover you're at this point and it didn't go quite as planned. Reassessment of the applicable standards, such as biocompatibility, electrical safety, software validation at this point in time, right in the prototype phase, is strongly recommended. Then you get into your verification validation phase. So as we know, this is where you're going to be doing yet another assessment, looking at your test data as it starts to come in, making sure you're complying with those standards, or you're at least at a minimum, your pass-fail criteria that you've established for your product. You, at this point, hopefully are going to start looking at some published data, maybe from some predicates, if that's available. That's going to start revealing how did that other Me Too device get through FDA? What sort of results were they providing? What were they leveraging as good results and safe and effective results with FDA? So it's a great time to reassess then. And of course, based on how your product is being tested, you can course correct at this point based on these new data insights. So now you can decide, well, can we justify not having to do usability testing? Is there a way for us to convince FDA that this is just like a product that is used heavily on the market already and really doesn't require any additional usability testing? Not always successful, but sometimes you can argue these things and FDA will cave in and give you some help there. And same thing with a clinical evaluation, right? Looking at other obstacles or how obstacles you've had during your design, your bench testing may also replay into how now you go through your clinical evaluation. Even if you're just doing cadaver testing, maybe you need to update your surgical technique guide to take into some, feasibility or some use issues you've encountered during your bench testing. So again, all of this may impact your predicate comparison discussions as well. Last but not least, ensuring market readiness. This is where you really want to double check all of your applicable regulations because quite frankly, normally the product development process is slow, right? Most of us spend a year, sometimes a lot more, sometimes 10 years developing a really amazing product. Obviously, it depends on the complexity that's involved, but especially for those of us who work on products that include software, a lot of these regulations are in flux. They keep changing. I mean, even the biocomp standards got updated a couple of years ago. So it's really important that you have your regulatory professional before you actually go to submit, ideally while you're sort of about to start your verification validation testing, that you're double checking to make sure that you've applied all the right regulations, you've taken a proactive approach to those evolving regulations in order to minimize any delays during the submission process, right? It may cause some impact to your testing, may cause some delays to your actual test strategy and getting the documents in place, but I'd rather take the hit then than take it while we're under review with FDA and they come back during the AI process and say, well, sorry, we can't clear this because there's actually a new version of the standard and you need to be compliant with that version. Hopefully that gets caught earlier than that, but still, it's worthy to investigate these changes as frequently as you can throughout the design and development process. All right, moving on. So we're at that point in the presentation, lucky for you, where we get to some key takeaways. So the benefits of involving regulatory early. Before we get to me giving you every bullet point that you're going to want to feverishly write down and note for the rest of your life as the roadmap to regulatory success, I am going to share with you a story. So once upon a time, I worked with a client who came to me with a fully designed medical device that they had spent countless hours and resources on. All that was needed was for me to write the submission. Of course, I asked all the usual questions. Have you determined your device classification? Have you identified a predicate? And so on. Their answers, well, the bewilderment was found in their deer eyes staring at me like headlights down a dark and foggy road. So we started back at the beginning. I said, here, please describe your device to me. What unmet clinical need is this device intended to address? Well, excitedly, they started explaining how the device could be used by either a clinician or a patient. It's very self-explanatory. It had a cool user interface. It was connected to the web. It had an accessory that attached to the body. Great. So I said, have you already done biocompatibility assessment for the patient contacting components then? Have you confirmed whether human factors testing is required to confirm that it is self-explanatory as you claim? And can it be used safely and effectively both by the clinician and the lay user? And by the way, is this device intended for children as well? Because we didn't really answer that question in your initial description. And you said it was connected, right? So does it have a USB port? Is there Bluetooth connectivity or something similar to that? So in that case, how are you ensuring cybersecurity? Have you done any penetration testing? Well, needless to say, this was an uncomfortable conversation. In short, they had to completely redesign their entire product. They had to choose different materials because the materials they had selected did not pass, so would never pass biocompatibility testing. Ultimately, they decided to put it in the hands of a clinician only to avoid having to spend extra time and money on human factors testing. They also decided to remove and eliminate all the connectivity because, quite frankly, cybersecurity testing and having it be a connected device, including all the long-term cybersecurity maintenance, was not something that their 10-person company was resourced for. At that point, they spent another 2 years revamping key design considerations, and sadly, they never made it. Like many startups, they ran out of money before they even had a chance to present it to FDA. So unfortunately, as much as I hate to say it, this story is nothing new in my world. Too many clients have come to me way too late in the game, have learned that these questions matter, these regulatory assessments matter early in product development, way early, right when you have an idea, ask these questions. Because if you don't, and if you wait too long, it may be too late to recover, especially if you're a small company with limited resources and limited budget. So with that, we will now get to the key takeaways. So key takeaways from today: strategic roadmap alignment aligns product development with regulatory requirements from the start, helps avoid costly redesigns by ensuring compliance considerations are integrated early. Next up is risk mitigation. This is where we identify all the regulatory risks and challenges proactively. It reduces the likelihood of unexpected delays or rejections in later stages. Cost and resource efficiency. This minimizes resource waste and non-compliant design elements, allows better planning for testing, documentation, and submission requirements. This then feeds into market entry timing. It helps to accelerate timing to market by ensuring a smoother regulatory process and pathway, enables better forecasting of product launch dates and market entry strategies. And finally, competitive advantage. Now you can position the company for competitive readiness with early stage compliance readiness, builds trust with stakeholders through strong commitment to safety and compliance by providing that regulatory strategy upfront and also being transparent about how it has changed over time. So with that, I'm hoping that those of you on the call today that I unfortunately can't see, I'm missing the engaged aspect of this webinar today, but hopefully you've been able to take away some key considerations and are starting now to really reconsider how early you should involve regulatory. And by the way, something that's not really covered in my presentation today, but has come up frequently, especially in my consulting life, is does it make sense to get a couple of regulatory opinions? Absolutely. I can tell you that there's a lot of things that I've done over and over and over throughout my career, but then there's sometimes a curveball that a client will throw at me and I go, "Ooh, that's a really good question. Maybe I need a second opinion. Maybe I should reach out to some of my regulatory colleagues and see what their thoughts are." If you're on the other side of the table and if you are a, CEO, a founder, part of an executive team, you're trying to lead and direct the company, it is absolutely okay to go and seek multiple regulatory opinions. It is also okay to have a regulatory agency working with you and then ask another one to sort of in the background be double checking that, we're doing the right thing here, and just all of those additional opinions, it really can't hurt. It can hurt, obviously, sometimes your budget, your pockets. But I can tell you that, at least for me, I would really, really prefer to identify those roadblocks, those potential issues, so that I can learn to pivot and get around them, take that fork in the road, know when it's the right time to actually say, hold up, let's take a different direction with this. Let's position it differently with FDA. Ooh, maybe right now is a great time to have a pre-submission meeting to get clarity on a particular topic. Engaging multiple regulatory opinions is never a bad idea. But if you can't afford to do that, at least go with a company like Kapstone. This is where I get to throw the plug in for my own company, where you get some really phenomenal resources, a full take-home strategy to identifying your engineering, your regulatory, all of your potential manufacturing and manufacturability concerns. So at least look for a resource that can really help support you and utilize professionals who have been there and done that and bring that to the forefront for you to help you navigate. So with that, I am done talking and I will open the floor to some questions.
Thank you so much, Kara. I'll hop back in here to open our Q&A session. But first, I just want to say thank you. Yes, yeah, it may be preaching to the choir to me, but I just want to validate absolutely the truth of the early and iterative sort of emphasis that you conveyed there. Through my experience at Greenlight Guru over the last couple of years, just have seen it play out exactly as you described, both on the success stories and the sort of, I guess, horror bedtime story that you told us. So absolutely, and really appreciate the advice. And I saw something pop up in the chat that I wanted to emphasize and just agree with. Just sharing of the recording of your message with top management decision makers, just because it may be a great way to convey the importance of this and sort of the value to decision makers if you're a QARA person who knows this and wants to send the message. So I just really appreciate your message for our attendees here today. So that's enough out of me. Well, let's dive into the QA. Given all that Kara just said, so I'm speaking to you now, audience. I want to ask a question. So in light of everything she described, I'm going to do 2 quick polls that I hope you'll respond to, and then we'll dive into your questions. There are a bunch of questions in there. This will be really quick. The first one is just, given everything Kara said, how confident are you in your understanding of the regulatory path to market for your medical device? You should be seeing that poll now. So we'll leave that open for a few seconds here. Got some votes coming in, a few clear and confident, some on general steps but needing guidance. Here we go. Now I'm sharing the results. Folks, while I'm waiting for these results to come in, I'm going to have a quick second poll question, then we'll dive into Q&A. Please feel free to pop your questions in now. It's not too late. Look at the Q&A tab. You can upvote questions that are there. If you like them and want the answer, you can also ask your own questions. So take a look at that and also answer our poll. So good. All right. Thanks. I'll leave that open for just a couple seconds more, and then I'll close it. Looks like we have a sort of a healthy mix here. All right. Thank you for the respondents there. I'm going to close that poll and ask sort of a second follow-on question here. I'll share that with you now. I'm going to open it. Very good. And share. Okay. The second question is, how confident are you in the success of your regulatory submission? Good. I see a few votes. Very confident. Good for you guys. Somewhat confident. You have a plan, but questions. Some not at all confident. So please answer that poll, folks, if you're seeing it. Good. Thank you. Seeing a lot of responses here. Some who haven't started the submission process yet. I'll just leave that open a few more seconds, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. I'm going to start with the most upvoted questions, and we'll share them on screen for Kara to provide her insights. So again, just pop it into the Q&A. One last note, because the question always comes up a few times, we will be sharing the recording and slides so that you can share those along to your top management if you need, or refer to them yourself. So, okay, great. Thank you for those poll responses there. I am going to close out that poll and stop sharing it, and then we'll move on to the Q&A here. I'm going to get these up on screen. Okay, very good. Kara, I'm going to share these with you and share them on screen for our attendees. So first question is, as a QA/RA professional, how would you approach a project that included RA at a late stage? This is a great question, and something I have seen multiple times where this wasn't done, the early and maybe iterative. So if we find ourselves now late in a project, this is the bedtime story scenario maybe. What do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I've experienced this a few times. So even with what I love to call sort of the brick and mortar companies that have been around for a long time, honestly, those are the ones that are usually the most guilty of this, because they have a lot of devices. They've had a lot of, successful submissions with the various international regulatory authorities. They think they know what they're doing. So they then only involve regulatory at the end of the process. Well, honestly, my approach and how to handle that is first go in with an open mind, right? I think it's easy as a regulatory professional, quite frankly, to get a little bit bitter about these mistakes. And if you go in thinking like, oh, they should have included me from day one, and that's just going to get you on the wrong foot with your team here. So go with an open mind. Just because they're bringing you in late doesn't necessarily mean that they've made a bunch of mistakes. So you really take sort of an open view, take a look at all the documentation, take a look at their justifications. Hopefully somewhere in a project charter, a project plan, they have outlined what their scope was, what their intentions were, what their V&V process was going to look like. So depending on when and where they have engaged you, go in with an open mind to looking at that. I think the next thing is just honestly be transparent in your thoughts about that. So if you are discovering that maybe there were some opportunities to do things a little differently or a little better, communicate that, right? I mean, I think it's up to executive management to learn how to handle constructive feedback. And I say that nicely, right? I am an executive. I've been on multiple executive teams at this point in my career. I think the companies, I'll say it again, the companies that are the most successful are the ones who can learn to pivot, embrace that change, and be receptive to constructive feedback. I think that there's always an opportunity to improve how we go through the product development process. I encourage project teams at the end of each phase, not just at the end of the project, but at the end of each phase, to have a lessons learned conversation where they pull all of the cross-departmental functions together and talk about what worked well and what didn't. So again, if I'm being involved late as a regulatory professional, I think my job is just to be honest and direct. And, I think sometimes we regulatory professionals, we fall into that trap of wanting to make our bosses happy and telling them what they want to hear. And I think sometimes, especially if you're new to the game, you're worried you're going to get fired if you present them with a sort of doomsday, like, oh boy, we need to completely redo our test strategy. This is not going to fly with FDA. But if you don't approach them at that point in time, and they get into that submission process, and it's FDA now coming to the company and saying, yeah, we just can't accept this the way it is. Not only have you added unnecessary time delay to getting that product to market, but potentially it's something you could have addressed and identified early on to avoid having that conversation altogether. So be open and willing to have uncomfortable conversations, I think, is my final answer to this question.
Yeah. No, I love that answer. And it seems to have a lot of integrity to me, just because if we're dedicated to the vision and the mission of what's trying to be accomplished, part of the responsibility is to improve the process. It's not about a blame game, but about helping. And so, yeah, some honesty and transparency is needed there. But yeah, great answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and share our next question from Kelly. This is interesting, interaction with a quality culture and interaction with regulatory. So what's your advice for implementing a quality culture and getting people on board with regulatory requirements? So you talked about how early and iteratively the regulatory requirements are going to impact the QMS and the processes as they're designed and the culture of quality at a company. So could you give us a little advice on getting folks on board with implementing these regulatory concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. So something that I'm actually really passionate about is establishing what your quality culture is at your company. And I cannot take credit for this. When I worked for Vapotherm back in the day, they had a fantastic way of engaging the whole company in this idea of a culture of quality. And that was, they had a dedicated 2 hours every single week where the entire company, even people in manufacturing, were told to stop and spend 2 hours on improving the things that impacted their day-to-day working mode, their documents, their work instructions, all of that to actually make their lives better and easier. And so I think you have to kind of look at what departments you're working with, what are the responsibility? What does your legal department have to do with regulatory? What does your marketing group have to do with regulatory? So first, it comes down to education, awareness, and training. So hopefully you have some really great quality and regulatory professionals at your company who can go and isolate each of the departments and explain to them what their relationship with regulatory requirements actually is. Because honestly, a lot of people, marketing people, they may not even really understand that there are rules and regulations they have to comply with respect to labeling, because a lot of marketing professionals are brought in, they worked at some other industry, maybe they were a news spokesperson in their past. I worked with one in the past, she was lovely, for the record. But they don't necessarily have training in med device. So first and foremost, make sure your teams are trained by regulatory and quality professionals so they understand their responsibilities and relationships to the QMS, to their product development, to their company as a medical device company. From there, consider engaging your folks directly. Assign them an assignment where they have to go and improve something that they work with, something they interact with on a daily basis. The more engagement that you get from your folks, the more invested they sort of have to be in the process. So it's a great way to not only ensure that your company is constantly evolving, constantly considering quality considerations and the evolution of product development and implementing changes over time, but it's also just a great way to get people talking to each other. Because I think another pitfall is in a especially large organization, people get so siloed, right? Your marketing department sits on the third floor, your engineering department, mechanical folks are on the first floor, ID folks are in a different building. Like, you've got everybody all over the place. So I think, having these opportunities for cross-departmental conversations, training, engagement really helps keep that quality culture at the forefront of their daily activities and daily considerations.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Amen to that. Yeah. True quality is one of GG's core values. And that's right. We believe, it's not just the quality and regulatory department or department's responsibilities. It's a whole company thing. And yeah, that's great. I've been through the we have to substantiate our claims conversation. And I agree. Having a sort of positive and educational collaborative approach is much more successful than, I can't believe these guys. So totally love that answer. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. This one is particular. Let me get it up on screen here. This is about usability or human factors. So would you expect that FDA requires a particular standard for usability, like 62366, or are they only concerned with alignment to the FDA guidance, which is a great guidance, I think, for human factors and usability?
Oh, this is a tricky one to answer. Honestly, I don't know that there's really a black and white answer to this particular question. Unfortunately, in my experience, it all comes down to your reviewer who looks at your documentation. I think if you have, done a really good job of justifying your human factors approach and how you conducted your usability testing, basing that on your user-related risk analysis, any things that you've identified as potential weaknesses in that interaction of your device to your user, I think you usually can navigate those conversations with FDA where they don't necessarily require strict compliance to the IEC 62366 standard. But honestly, obviously, the more you are able to implement, tried and true test methods that are in the standards, it avoids a lot of justifications that your regulatory and quality professionals are going to have to write. So I think, again, you have to look at your device, you have to look at your product requirements, and you have to sort of decide what risks are you willing to take in that conversation with FDA or your regulating bodies, and how much do you want to engage with them in defending your position on these things. So that's maybe not a fantastic answer to give you super clarity, but I don't know that there's a wrong way to do it. I just think you have to be confident in the direction that you go.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I've seen this question come up in conversations with customers, especially. I think there's a draft guidance floating out there that's list of high priority devices. It is still draft. And so the question is always, well, do we have to do usability? What do we need? And I'll just give a plug to something I think I first heard from Etienne, either live or on a blog or something, which is, good usability is part of just good design. And so it's not all about standards compliance, although ultimately you got to show FDA what they need. But yeah, I appreciate your answer there. I will mark that as answered, and we'll go on to the next one. Let's see. I'm skimming quickly here. This may be similar to our first question. What do you do with a management team that didn't involve regulatory until the very end, but started a submission project, but doesn't realize they didn't start collecting the required documentation from the start, and that it doesn't now exist. We may have kind of covered this in the first one. Anything new to add here, or maybe there's a slight kind of difference in shade of meaning here?
I sort of read there's a little nuance in this question. Is more around documentation and the fact that like I sort of interpret this to the person who asked this question as like, how do you catch up, right? Like you may have some documentation, but you may be missing some documentation, and like how do you bridge the gap? How do you get there? Obviously I am very biased in this opinion, but I do think you should involve regulatory early in your documentation creation, because we are there to make sure the audience that this is intended for is being met, that you can explain things to your regulatory folks. And honestly, we're not just looking at your submission process, right? We're also, most of these documents are actually substantiating your DHF, and that's going to defend you in a future inspection with FDA as well. So a good regulatory professional is not just looking at the end game of getting this cleared or approved by FDA. It's also looking at how do you sustain defending your quality decisions to future inspectors and future project iterations as well. So, I think if they didn't start collecting the required documentation from the start and now they're trying to play catch up, I think it's important to consider doing design reviews, right? You may have done some mechanical design reviews, maybe physical design reviews along the way, but a really good phase-gated product development plan will actually have you have stops in place. Like you cannot go past go until you actually have certain things documented. So, it's on your quality and regulatory professionals to keep you honest during those product development phases. I think when I've encountered this issue, it's mostly been with startups. It's mostly been with companies that, quite frankly, don't necessarily even have a QMS, quite frankly, and they're sort of just designing in their sandbox, and they've got $10,000 and they want to go submit to FDA, and how do we get there? And then I have to come in and say, all right, well, here's the core documentation I need for the submission. And then here's the secondary set of documentation that I'm supposed to have to support your quality system and then future inspections. And so I think that you have to get creative about how you tackle that project and problem. And, you sort of look at the pros and cons and how do you tell the story? Because I think I freely admit that I am a little bit more open to having conversations with inspectors, having conversations with FDA about being honest that, yeah, we got a little over the tips of our skis here in terms of product development. So we did document that kind of after the fact of what we had done to get there. Honestly, 99% of the time, I've met with some very reasonable regulators who go, okay, well, small slap on the wrist, but make sure you follow your phase gates the next time around as now you make changes to your product. So, I'm not saying it's the right way to do it. You absolutely should follow your quality management system, go through those phase gates, ensure you have all the required documentation as you proceed. But I don't think it's the end of the day, end of the world if you haven't done that. I think that there's a way you can recoup. And quite frankly, great opportunity to pull in some regulatory consultants and have you navigate those gaps and find creative ways to filling those gaps and getting it done as quickly as possible.
All is not lost.
All is not lost.
I'll piggyback my own just little question on that, if I may, just about sort of the practical approach to incorporating regulatory consultant like yourself in the design process. How is that typically done? Like, are they sitting in on design reviews? And what advice do you give to, a small startup who maybe they're worried about racking up hours, or they're worried about how much involvement? So like, practically speaking, how do you involve your regulatory resource in that design process iteratively? What does it look like to make sure everything's, moving in alignment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for those of you who work at bigger, well-established companies who have a regulatory team, you're already paying for that salary. So involve them from day one. You kind of have no excuse not to be honest. That's my brutal, blunt answer. They're already there for them, right? But if you are a startup, smaller stage company, you don't have an internal regulatory professional, again, I strongly advise you to engage with that person, at least in the very beginning. Do that regulatory assessment. And then honestly, ask your regulatory professional when they think they should be involved, because everybody's going to come with their own opinion. I could give you my answer today that, oh, well, at least once a month, I'd like to touch base with you and make sure that we're still on the same track. But depending on the rate at which you're developing your product, how many resources you have working on your project, those touch points may vary, right? That you kind of have to right size your engagement with your regulatory professional based on, again, resource needs, budget needs, the speed at which you're developing your product. So there is no kind of one size fits all answer. But I would, generically speaking, I think if you're on your project team and you're like, wow, should we involve regulatory? The answer is probably already should have, right? If you're asking the question, yes, you probably should have involved them. But again, I think establishing a relationship, if you have a consultant like myself, having like a standing once a week, once a month, whatever's appropriate to your product is the best way to continue. And honestly, for those of us who do bill hourly, we try to be really honest and transparent, and we'll say, you don't need me right now. Like you're good until you get to this point. I don't think I need to be involved. Like a good regulatory consultant professional will work with you in that way, because we are sensitive to the fact that you don't have a lot of money, and quite frankly, we're expensive. So, we will try to manage that relationship to suit both parties as best as possible.
Yeah, that's great. I'll pop in the next question here. It's a little bit of a different angle we haven't talked about yet, but I want to mention my colleague and friend Alex has popped a link into the chat for that FDA guidance document on human factors and usability for anyone who hasn't seen it. So you can find that in the chat. The pivot here on this next question is just the incorporation by reference ISO 13485, so QSR to QMSR transition. Kind of a general question. Just what are your thoughts? I guess in terms of regulatory implications. Yeah, have any thoughts for us?
Yeah. So, oh wow, way to put me on the chopping block, folks. Okay, so. Here's what I would say. In my personal opinion, the gap between 21 CFR 820 and ISO 1345 is actually not that big. And I think especially if you're a company that's targeting international submissions, so if your scope is to not just be a US based product, it always made sense to be ISO 1345 compliant. Obviously, for all of us, we'll have to get there by, what is the date? I think it's February 2026, somewhere around there. So we're all headed that direction anyways. But I do think, my personal opinion is that I think FDA finally acknowledged that the gap and the differences between 21 CFR 820 and ISO 1345 really is not that insurmountable. I think that we can all get there. They're reasonable requests for the most part. I certainly have my opinions about MDR, which do not follow quite in the same positive light as my thoughts on ISO 1345. But I think, honestly, the incorporation of it is really going to help companies be better positioned, especially if you're looking at growth and future growth of their companies. You're going to start looking at, well, what if we wanted to be MDSAP compliant? How does, 21 CFR is like the beginning small step, but now being ISO 1345 compliance gets you that much closer. So if you can kind of have that proactive mindset that, we want our companies to grow, we want to make more revenue. A lot of times that means expanding into new markets. ISO 1345 is going to be one of the tools to help you get there. So I do think it's a great thing.
Yeah, it's funny, your comments on MDR. I think that the European Parliament might agree with you. I think it's just like last week or in the next 10 days, there's a request for a major revision, I think. So we'll see what goes there, but I tend to agree with you. Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. That's great. Let me share another question here. I'll get it up on screen. Okay, so for an AI ML enabled SAMD mobile app, what kind of regulatory implications should we think about in regards to Bluetooth accessories? This is a little bit of a free consulting question, I think. So,
Wow.
Any just top concerns that you've seen come up with this type of device? This is, I think, a things to think about or implications. Any sort of on your top list that spring to mind?
Yeah, so honestly, I am currently working with a couple of folks who are in this space. We're starting to touch on this area, this new territory of AI and ML enabled software as medical device mobile apps, as well as just regular devices, not even just mobile apps. I can tell you my personal opinion is that this is still a little bit of the Wild West with respect to how FDA considers AI and ML and how they're regulating it. I think it's one of those things that it's going to continue to adapt and change over time as companies, unfortunately, we in industry, we're always like 4 steps ahead of FDA, right? Like we kind of create the forward momentum. And this is a great example of forward momentum and how technology is a little ahead of the regulations. So, I honestly would recommend, and everybody always has different opinions about pre-submissions, but I do think that if you have an AI, ML, or even just regular software device, it's never horrible to engage with FDA early and have these conversations. You have to be thoughtful about the questions that you're asking. I could talk for hours about strategy on how to engage with FDA and the kinds of questions that actually result in fruitful information that you can take away and actually make decisive decisions on your product development and the scope of your product. But I will share with all of you that I've recently had a few conversations with some folks at FDA that their mindset on engaging with med device companies is changing. I having been around for a while now, I can tell you that I was raised in this regulatory world to sort of the like, don't talk to FDA. Oh my gosh, like make sure you're always super polite and you're not a human and you're robotic in your interactions and it's all formal and documented.
Yes or no questions only.
Exactly. So like that was how I was kind of raised and thought and told to, regard FDA. Well, I can tell you happily that is changing. FDA is really being told internally they're being encouraged to have a lot more what I call informal conversations with their clients, with us as their clients. Recently, I had a great conversation with a lead reviewer on a product that I don't have as a submission right now. I had it as a submission and now we're making some changes. And I called her up and said, hey, I know this isn't actually under review, but would you be willing to have kind of an informal brainstorming session with me? And she said, sure. I'll give you a half hour on my calendar. I was shocked, but it was great. And I actually picked her brain about like, why were you so willing to talk to me? I mean, I know I'm lovely, but why were you so willing to have this conversation? And she said, oh no, FDA is definitely being like kind of told that if we have a little spare time on our calendars, that we want to encourage early and frequent conversations with industry. So again, to kind of tie it back to this question, I would encourage you to not be afraid to engage with FDA early, talk about some of your considerations, be open about what you're struggling with. Again, it's going to take some strategic ways to how you write the questions to get some really meaningful feedback from FDA, but it is possible, absolutely possible to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, a lot of changes over there at FDA, right? I mean, the CDRH reorganization, I think Jeff Shuren retired or something. I'm not totally up to speed on all the changes, but eager to see what the impacts will be on industry and our customers. So yeah, thanks for that insight. I love the idea of a kind of friendlier, more conversant FDA that you can just ask the questions, get it kind of straight from the horse's mouth. That sounds good to me.
Another fun thing that they recently did on one of my products was they actually asked, after we submitted, they asked us to host what they called an orientation meeting. It was actually where we just did a PowerPoint, and before they even started digging into the submission details, we gave them an overview of the product and told them how it works and what it does and some cool things about it. And they kind of just sat there and smiled and nodded. And then at the end, they were like, thank you. That helps us get going. Great. Wish they had been doing that for years. That would have been really helpful.
Yeah, it seems like helpful on both sides. You get to kind of like make your case and explain your device. We don't just dive right into a substantial equivalence table, but like, hey, here's what this thing's all about. And now you can, now you have context for the submission rather than trying to like, you're fitting a hyperlink into your summary or something like that. Like, go watch this video, please. That's really good. Well, that's something to look forward to. Thanks for the bright spot. We're down to our last couple questions here. We've got about 15 minutes remaining. I want to leave a couple minutes at the end for just one last request for our audience, so I won't make you hold your breath. But a couple more questions here. One related to AI, one about second opinions. I'll share this really quick. We've talked about seeking a second opinion. I love that was going to be one of my questions for you on getting a second opinion, and you kind of already addressed it there at the end of your presentation. So I appreciate that, because I think it's a question that comes up a lot. Like, you know, for folks who are taking this, the value and the importance really seriously, and realize the criticality of this regulatory assessment early on and throughout, you know, they want to be really sure. So in being really sure, they're seeking a second opinion. So to get to the chase, what are the best resources for getting second opinions? I suppose this comes from a place of kind of not knowing maybe who to ask. If you don't, you know, maybe you have a regulatory consultant and you want a second one, or you're working with a group and you don't know who to go to.
Yeah, so this is honestly a great question. And I think when you consider the different folks who could be asking this, it's not always just sort of the executive team who's saying, oh, well, what other resources could we ping for getting a second opinion? I think honestly, even internal regulatory folks could be saying, well, who do we go to for a second opinion? First and foremost, on my teams, I encourage frequent touch points, even internally, right? So we are constantly meeting and discussing and brainstorming. And, you know, I mean, I've been in this industry for over 20 years, but I don't necessarily claim to be an expert at everything regulatory related, right? I mean, I think we each come to the table with our different skills and experience and expertise. So I encourage frequent conversations internally for second opinions, right? So I think that's one resource that you should never forget, is that you may already have folks on your teams when you present your obstacles, you know, your questions, your roadblocks. Look to them. They are your first, you know, first point of reference and first shield against these problems. So ask inside first, and then second, of course, you know, there's a bunch of consulting agencies out there like Kapstone who provide great resources in all departments, not just regulatory. I think the advantage of working with a company like Kapstone that has all of the departments is that, for example, when I am doing a regulatory assessment for a client, I actually will go to, say, our manufacturing lead and say, oh, you know, I've got this product and they've asked me to do a reg assessment for it. Could you just take a quick look at the design and what do you think could be the roadblock? So I think for those of you who go to regulatory consultants who are just regulatory consultants and don't have those other resources that they can kind of cross compare notes with, you know, you may or may not get into some weaknesses in those cases. So I think, you know, for me, being part of a team of experts in the different departments actually makes me a better resource for that regulatory opinion. So be selective, be careful about who you're choosing to work with as that second opinion. Also looking, I mean, a great cheat sheet. And I think, you know, for those of you who are looking for links, honestly, do your 510K search and look at who submitted the 510K. I mean, honestly, one of the ways that I cheat, if I have a question, I'll go and look to see who was a regulatory professional or consultant who actually submitted that 510K. And I've been known to cold call a couple of folks and be like, hey, I'm working for this company and I see you submitted a product that's really similar. Would you mind if I pick your brain? Worst case scenario, they're going to say, sorry, can't talk to you. It's proprietary information. Okay, I respect that and I step away. Best case scenario, they're like, oh, a buddy in regulatory. And then they open the kimono and you have a great conversation, right? So, you know, look at that as a resource. You're stuck.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's great. That's a great tip. I have not heard that, and it seems like a brilliant tip. So thank you very much. Well, we're down to our last question here, and then I have one quick request for our audience. This one, again, is on AI. We get lots of questions, both at GG, and I'm sure you get them too, about AI, ML, predetermined change control plans, all those sorts of things. So this question is about if you're modifying a product already on the market, which with, let's say, AI capability, which requires a new 510K, how do you figure out what is the concept phase? So I think this question is related conceptually to, like, you're making a change, but introducing a sort of big new element. Where are we in the design control process?
It's a great question. So, you know, I think that the individual features and functionality related to your AI, it by itself is like, if you think of it in terms of modules, that is going to start off in the concept phase, because you're going to be vetting, like, do we need to add this functionality to the product? What benefit does that AI component bring to this existing component? So I think a lot of that's going to get vetted in a concept phase. But in reality, in terms of how you walk it back and roll it back into your quality management system, I think I've worked for a couple of different companies who do it differently. Some do it as like a documentation DCO. They never really officially revert back to a phase. Personally, I don't love that. I think that a lot of opportunities for missing strategic decision points, looking at opportunities for testing, looking at opportunity for resource assignment, honestly, comes from companies, if they're doing it well, they treat it like a new project, even if they're just implementing an additional concept into the device. And so I really strongly recommend that you roll it back at least to phase 2, which of course is your design and development phase, because you're going to have to design and develop that new component anyways. And you should be issuing, in my opinion, you should be issuing a new project plan that's going to clearly delineate that you're leveraging your original product, but here are the modifications and changes that you're making to that product. And then you're considering the impact. So you're going to walk through, okay, now as we look at the additional phases, what needs to change, what needs to be redone, right? As you're looking at your V&V, for example, there's probably a huge amount of stuff you're not going to have to retest as long as you're not touching it. But as you're looking at, especially in software, right? Software, that's its own problematic beast, if you will, right? I think convincing FDA that you didn't break your software if you only tested just the new stuff, that's usually a conversation that doesn't go well. Honestly, I've had lots of battles with companies over the years about, I know it sucks to repeat all of your software verification and validation, including the new stuff you just added, but trust me, the pain that you're going to go through with FDA to justify and document and convince them that you haven't broken anything in the other parts of your software that you swear you didn't affect with your new stuff, just retest. Like, you're going to avoid so much more hassle. And of course, we end up having really great philosophical debates about time and money and resources and what that all means. But this is where you get into, again, in my opinion, if you get to your AI letter and it's that they're not convinced you vetted your remaining components of your software fully, what option do you have but to follow my original advice, which was to just go retest everything? So I think, again, really looking at an additional feature or component to a product as a new project and starting over at the beginning of your product development phases, that's what I recommend. And obviously, you have the opportunities if you have really good quality professionals who understand how to write justifications and rationales. Not every aspect of every phase necessarily needs to be repeated. You just need to document your thinking and your justifications for why you didn't repeat it. So it's not, even if you start back at phase 0, it's not actually going to necessarily add more time. What it's going to do is prevent you from making a bunch of mistakes. And also, to the previous question about missing documentation, it ensures that you've revised and created the additional documentation you need for this new functionality.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much. You, nailed all the questions and right on time. So my kudos to you. I see comments streaming in here about just the value of this presentation and your helpfulness. So absolutely. I have one request before everybody leaves, please. Just a little plug here. I have one request, and it is every year Greenlight Guru puts out a State of MedTech report. This is just real quick. It's to better understand industry trends, priorities, strategies, commercialization challenges, best practices shaping the medtech industry. It's both interesting to read when it comes out, but in order for it to be valuable, we need people to participate and answer the survey. So we're working on our 2025 report, and we'd love to hear your experiences, audience members. You're the folks we're trying to reach. So please check out the link. It should be coming across your screen in a moment here, and we'd love to hear your insights. Oh yeah, there it is at the bottom there. Thank you. Please take the survey. We'd love to hear information, and then look for the report when it comes out. It's got good and juicy stuff in it, at least I've found for the last couple of years. So that's it. Well, Kara, thank you so much. This was great. Super informative presentation. I know from the comments here that people found it really valuable. The entire session was just chock full of great information. So as a final reminder, we are going to be sending today's recording and presentation slides. And so that's it. On behalf of Greenlight Guru, I just want to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Kara, for such a great session, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.